All right, good morning to ROCon Day 2. I hope you're ready for some risk yoga. I do have yoga pants on underneath here. I just want you to know that. Okay. Before we jump in, I'd like to tell a little story. So, in a prior life, I was a chief risk officer in the insurance space, had a large publicly traded auto manufacturer, and they had just bought a tower of insurance. I don't know if you know how insurance works. You buy towers of limits of protection, and we were the primary on that. That means if something bad happens, we'd be the first ones to write a check. So the CFO and the CISO invited me in to talk about strategy, specifically how they're going to invest to protect this large publicly traded auto manufacturer. So I asked the CFO, why did you buy insurance? And his answer was ransomware. And my thought was, you sound normal. That makes sense. Good idea. And I said, I'm just curious, though, what about ransomware? You're a large global manufacturer. I'm assuming that building product and delivering product, receiving resources is important. I'm just going to assume that ERP is important. And he actually said, no. He said, ERPs are important. To which he said, we have 7, 5 SaaS, 2 on-prem, and he said, I know where you're going next. If any one of them was down for an hour or more, it's multiple millions of dollars per hour. Okay? I said, okay, great. I turned to the CISO and I said, did you know that? And I looked at him, he was turtling. He was hiding a little bit. He's like, I did not know that. And I said, okay, we're amongst friends. So I then turned back to the CFO and I said, okay, have you ever had an outage before? And he said, no. I said, all right. Assume you did get ransomware, and one of these on-prem ERP systems got fried. Think, NotPetya sort of fried, right? You had to do a complete rebuild. Now I'm turning to the CISO as well. Tell me, what's the surprisingly longest amount of time it would take you to rebuild these? I'm talking about the average time, the longest, reasonable, thoughtful amount of time it would take your organization to rebuild this, to rehydrate the data and get it functional so you can move cars again. They talked amongst one another, and the CFO turned to me, he said, 21 days. I said, okay. Now, what's the fastest you can rebuild this, knowing your resources, knowing your IT and everything, what's the fastest? They talked again, and they said 3 days. I said, okay. That's a long time if it's millions of dollars per hour. I turned to the CISO, now really turtling, and I said, did you know this? He goes, no. Then my next question was, do you have a 3-2-1 strategy? Do you have backups, both cold and hot? Have you done any testing on this? And this time the CISO is starting to leave the room. The answer was no. He didn't know this. This was an easy set of questions to ask. It was not difficult at all. This process, by the way, being able to ask questions about what risk actually means to the business with your stakeholders is at the heart of risk yoga. With that, this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to start with grounding the mind, with the right concepts of measurement. Next, asana, posing the question, what's our value at risk? You just heard a little bit of that. Then, Kriya, acting with intention, eliminating risk that matters. The right concept of measurement is the path to risk enlightenment. The right concept of measurement is the path to risk enlightenment. Let's unpack that. You must understand the tangible versus the intangible. All right? Risk management piece begins when we find the tangible within the intangible. So I have some questions for you. I'm going to actually look for people, at least the ones I can see. This is attacker sophistication. Attacker sophistication. You see this in NIST 853. It's used in FAIR, if you guys know FAIR. Here's a question for you. Raise your hands if you think this distinction is tangible. Raise your hands. Okay, there's one. Raise your hands if you think it's intangible. And all of those who didn't raise your hands, I'm assuming you're too tired and drank too much last night. All right? All right. Here's another one. Attack complexity. Attack complexity. This is in CVSS, NIST 853, and NIST 830. Is this tangible? Raise your hands if you think it's tangible. Come on, play ball. Okay. You think it's tangible, all right? Raise your hands if you think it's intangible. Okay, last one. Remotely exploitable. This is used everywhere. It's used in everything. Is this tangible or intangible? If you think it's tangible, raise your hands. Raise your hands if you think it's intangible. Did I say that? Tangible? And raise your hands if you think I'm trying to trick you. Okay, good. All right. What would you see occurring specifically, empirically, mathematically, unambiguously, that would let you know that this is true? This is a powerful question for you. When you're trying to understand whether you're measuring something that actually exists, ask yourself this question. Maybe you can confront people with this question as well. What would I see occurring specifically, empirically, auditably, mathematically, unambiguously, that would let me know that this is true? By the way, all intangible. Okay, uncertainty versus knowability. Uncertainty versus knowability. Except that some fog can lift with light, and not all risk that is uncertain is unknowable. Here's a question for you, all of you again. We'll do a hand raise on this one. If your CFO, your CEO, a board member, or someone else who's scary walks into your office or cube space, wherever it is, and says, will we have a 0 day next week? Because that last one was really disturbing. Are we going to have one or not? Right? Would you say that is, raise your hand if that's uncertain. Okay. Raise your hand if it's unknowable. All right, good. More hands are raising. It is very knowable. It is very knowable, depending on how you understand what uncertainty is. Okay, so I didn't build this. ChatGPT built this for me in about 2 minutes. I took 5 years of the TAG group out of Google TAG, right, Project 0 Day. I took 5 days of their data, 5 years of their data, and I asked it to build what we call a count model, a Bayesian count model. I gave it some specifications, literally in 2 minutes, and then I asked it to generate data based on that model, using their data plus that model. And I inspected the CSV it created, and then I asked it to build this based on it. So right here, by the way, this golden line crosses at 50. This is the median time, so this is the median time. You could expect, given on 5 years of data, given their data, that's not all the data in the world, that's some of the data, that you could expect roughly every 6 days to have one of these with a 50% chance, and you have a 95% chance of experiencing one in 25.3 days. Now, if you hold to predicting the future perfectly, precisely, you can't do that. If that is your understanding of prediction, perfect prediction of the future perfectly, then you must start hiring astrologers and palm readers. All right, forecastable versus unpredictable. We kind of just did that, but we're going to expand this. Forecastable versus unpredictable. And here's a question for you again. Okay, well, actually, I've got a clever statement. To forecast is to not know the future, but to honor its shape. Actually, this is a deep sauce right here. Right? To forecast is not to know the future, but to honor its shape. That's clever. All right? Here's a question. What's the chance of a Fortune 500 manufacturing company, we'll go with that, right? What's the chance of a Fortune 500 manufacturing company having a material breach? Now, I'm going to define material for you because the SEC for almost 100 years has not defined it for you. But I'll define it for our purposes today. A material breach, first of all, means it's public. It means you can know about it. You can actually know about it now, and there was some amount of financial losses documented. So this is a very specific question. This is a very specific set of evidence. It's not just that they had a bad thing happen, not just they had a compromise, that there was a public breach, right? They're Fortune 500, they're manufacturing, and there's losses. Okay, so imagine there's 500 here, and I spin around the bucket of Fortune 500 manufacturing companies, and I pick one up by its hair and hold it up. I want to have a couple of answers from brave people. Give me an answer. What do you think the probability is? Someone shoot one. By the way, can't be people who are in my talk on Tuesday. I see you. So, what's the chance? Someone shout out a number. 70%. I heard 70%. I heard mumbling here. 80? 100%? Okay. Yours was 70? Okay. All right, let's do this. Let's imagine that there's roughly 100 Fortune 500 manufacturing companies. There probably is, roughly. Let's say they're all lined up here, right? And let's say in each company there's a special person who holds a 10-sided die. This is, by the way, this is a great exercise for you, so remember this. You have this 10-sided die, and the person in each company, so all 100 companies today, they roll it, right? How many companies will have experienced a material breach out of 100, given your statistic? 70. Yes, you had 70. How many, let me just ask you this, how many Fortune 500 companies in the last year have had a public material breach? No. Try again. Maybe one? We had Jaguar. There's one. That's good. How about another one? Would you like to update your beliefs about what the probability is of experiencing a material public loss? Go again. New number. Good. By the way, that's great. That's what you want to do. By the way, there's a good friend here, Doug Hubbard, sitting right there. He's famous for saying, you have more data than you think, right? You have more data than you think. You need less data than you think, right? This is the answer. Roughly, look at the data. It kind of wiggles in here. Notice there's some tails out here, right? You can have things that go way out here. You go way out here, right? It's all a function of the questions I'm asking, right? Yeah, the 100% was wrong. Okay, so data versus expertise. Wisdom arises when data and discernment meet. When data and discernment meet, neither one alone is enlightenment. We like to say data-driven. That's fun to say. I like to say that. I say it all the time. But really, it's decision-driven. Let's talk about this. Anyone here, other than Doug, read this book? Raise your hands. Anybody? All right. Well, if you raise your hands, I would call you a nerd. Doug is a nerd. Right? Great book. Philip Tetlock was a researcher. He was a researcher that was invited by our federal government to compete in a competition on forecasting. You may not know this, but our federal government, all federal governments, are involved in this idea of forecasting. Forecasting will Trump put out another mean tweet? Will Kim Jong-un get a new haircut? Will some other nation-state thing happen? I've actually been on a prediction market platform concurrently where there are 70,000 spies in the US doing regular forecasts. This is big business. And so they wanted to get better. They called him in, and he put together a team of 100 normal people. They did not work in the federal government. They were not in the business of making forecasts. And he trained them up to make forecasts like weathermen, using the thing called the Breyer score. He trained them up, and they did a series of competitions with our government. Here's one of the cool ones, right? 2018, hybrid human-machine systems. So he had 100 super forecasters, which defeated over 1,000 people using machine learning. So you had the federal government with 1,000 people who do this for a living, making forecasts, using computers. They failed to win against Phil's team, who were just trained to make forecasts like weather people. His team won every single competition they entered. And not just by a little, by a lot. Okay? Forecasts. So imagine instead of 100 random people, you had 120 award-winning elite researchers involved in making forecasts. Right? What if you brought that together with data? Right? Where they're looking at things like, attack paths and whatnot. So this is a form of collective intelligence. That's what they were doing previously. So bringing collective intelligence to bear with massive amounts of data and machine learning. What might you call that? I would call that generative controls intelligence. This is the idea of meshing elite forecasters, award-winning forecasters, with data, with AI, to do things like this. Right? So you can start looking at what losses are. So bringing in large amounts of industry data on losses, right? A large database of industry data, bringing in collective intelligence, and bringing in petabyte-scale security data to start making forecasts about how you can optimize your deploy of controls, similar to what the CFO had invited me in at that large publicly traded manufacturer. Okay? All right. I don't know if you know this, every time his beard's been growing. Anyone here, raise your hands if you noticed his beard was growing. Okay, yeah, all right. Every single picture, his beard was growing just a little bit. All right, he's gotten out of control now. So, beating the competing model. How many of you read my first book that I co-authored with Doug? Right? This comes from that, all right? The risk yogi does not seek the perfect model, only one that outperforms the competing model. We're not looking at the perfect future, like I said, if you want to do the perfect future, hire palm readers, right? We want to beat the competing model. So I'm going to tell a story. There are two hikers going out hiking, and they show up, and this one hiker here says to this other hiker, "Why are you wearing running shoes? I don't understand. Why would you do that?" And she says to him, "Well, I heard there are bears out here." And he goes, "You'll never outrun a bear." And she goes, "No, but I will peacefully outrun you." All right? That's the idea of beating the competing model. Make sense? All right. So you've got a little warmed up. You're in the right space now. We're going to do asana, posing the question, what is our value at risk? Again, that was the question that I went right to the CFO with. All right, get some water. I had so much fun with AI in this one. It had it make that picture. Isn't that great? And here's a great quote that goes with that, if it shows up. Oh, there you go. Uncertainty is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd one. Bertrand Russell. You guys know who he is, right? All right. Attack surface. This is where you all mostly live. You live here, and it's a good place to be. You have assets, right? They can have many vulnerabilities. What's residual to your controls is your exposure, right? And then when threats get a hold of when they attack and send angry packets at your exposure, it can lead to compromise. This is really attack surface. This is broader than just external attack surface. This is all of it, all right? There's a bigger, badder world out there, which is called risk surface. You heard about that from Sumed when he spoke yesterday. You've heard this term. So you can have compromise all day long. By the way, the person who said 100%, we see this all day long, 100% of compromise. But if you don't have value at risk, right, then you don't really have impact. And then residual after you do risk transfer to insurance, remember I talked about in towers of insurance? What's residual to that is your actual losses. This is the treasure zone. This is where your CEO lives, where your board lives, where your investor lives, where your E-team lives. And this is typically where security lives. And what we're trying to say is there's a bigger, badder world out there that you need to be part of, that we need to be part of, right? This is a function, there we go, of this stuff, strategy. This could be at the enterprise level, could be at the business unit level, right? There's a strategy, there's an opportunity, market, advantages your business is going to go after, and there are ways that they digitize this. They're doing AI and digital transformation. It's that AI and digital transformation that exposes value to the world, right? And in turn, this is a continuous process, by the way, and this is the job of modern cybersecurity risk management. And by the way, this is not me making this up. This is an observation of reality. This is actually what's going on in reality, all right? So now that we've talked about that, let's move into Korea. Acting with intention, eliminating risks that matter. To be everywhere is to be nowhere, Sun Tzu. So the strategy of that CISO, the previous company, his strategy was to spread way too little butter across way too much bread, to quote Tolkien there, right? Too little butter across too much bread. His strategy was to be everywhere. Right? And that's the default strategy of most CISOs, by the way, to be everywhere, to spread all your resources across everything. And it's untenable. All right? So let's talk about this a little further. In insurance, we call these perils. You can call these losses. The disruption one was the one I was going after the CFO. I was asking about that. You got that? For a crown jewel, right? And then what's causal to perils are these things, which you all know. These are threats. You may or may not know this. There's a many-to-many relationship between these things. If you were to look at your insurance policy, you would see this. Ransomware, by the way, is so popular because it's a triple dipper. All right? So that means that with ransomware, obviously their strategy is to extort you. The means or tactics for that is to do business disruption first and then data breach. 70% of traditional ransomware includes data breach, just over 70%. So it's a triple dipper. Extortion is the smallest financial impact to you, right? So let's talk a little bit more about this. It leads to impacts, right? You have cash, revenue, and market cap. There was two large breaches recently in the UK, which you're familiar with, right? They had huge impacts on future revenue. One was associated with retail because they had 50 days of downtime on their cloud marketplace. they had major impacts in the tunes of about $400 million to future revenue not realized, right? The one that was more recently in the auto manufacturing has both of these, cash and revenue. In fact, the cash situation was such that they had to get a loan, 5-year loan, from their government to the tune of about, it was $2 billion US, 1.5 billion pounds. Market cap, this comes in play, and for the retail one, they had it was a 6.7% impact to their market cap that only lasted a week. CrowdStrike's lasted months. So we think about these things when we're thinking about risk surface, but there's more to the story. What you may not know is that a lot of these things, long-term, are driven by this thing, penalties, when you think about compliance and whatnot. So there's a long tail. So again, I mentioned I was a chief risk officer in insurance. You'll have things, particularly on the criminal side, civil side, regulatory, that go on for years and years and years. We don't hear about that. We hear about the big hit that's first. There's this whole long tail of things that happen. And oftentimes there's concurrent to these that are overlapping for large companies. All right? This is your value at risk, all this. That's your value at risk. This is the treasure zone. This is where your board lives. This is where your E-team lives. This is where your investors think about. And my encouragement for you is to start living there as well, inclusive of this, the whole thing. All right? So you have controls and you have exposures, right? You have, this is obviously the old school look of attack paths, right? I mentioned this generative controls intelligence where you start bringing all the data together so that you can start doing things like this. This is what the CFO brought me in for. It's for this. How can I start taking what is my too little, like not enough butter? How can I spread that effectively on the things that matter? This is what he asked for. This is what he wanted, right? But I led with, what do you stand to lose? Okay. There we go. The goal is to maximize his return on investment, right? That's return on control and return on efficiency. Return on control and return on efficiency. I'm going to buy these things, these security things. How's it going to help me maybe reduce headcount? How's it going to help me cover more with less? Trust me, if you're not sure what your CFO wants, ask him or her if they want that. And they will say, of course. All right. That together is risk surface management. All of that. All right? And this is what it looks like for you. All that detail, I know that was ugly and intense, and I saw a lot of pictures going up. That's great. But we're simplifying this for you at this level. This is the doorway to go into this, where we're looking at, in this case, this is revenue-based on the top, right? This is the state of current control, the residual, 690, algorithms, using collective intelligence, using large data, recommending that you go here. And helping you, and this is what's coming in the product, helping you figure out how you use your capital most efficiently to get there. Enterprise true risk management. And that's risk yoga. And now you're better for it. Yeah, sure. I'll ask questions. But any questions? Come on. If you don't ask questions, I'll start going into dad jokes. And if you were in my talk yesterday, you heard Scott Stransky, I'm worse than him. Any questions about this? Yes? How would you quantify brand damage from a breach? That was not a softball. I did not ask him to ask me that question. That is the best question ever. What about brand reputational damage? That's a great question. First of all, we call it a second order effect. Right? So my second public CISO gig, I talked to my CEO when I started, interview, and he said brand reputational risk was their biggest concern. And I asked them, well, what would you see occurring that lets you know specifically, materially, mathematically, unambiguously, remember that? That would let you know that was occurring. I said it more nicely, because I didn't want to come across as arrogant. He said, customer churn. This is a company that had about 1 million developers using their APIs. You're actually able to get your Ubers and Lyfts today because of this company. And I said, okay, great. But what caused that? Remember the causal map? He's talking about brand damage. We'd lose customers, right? But what would cause that? And he said the platform stopped working. Business disruption. That was causal. So that's the first order effect was a business disruption, which could be measured in dollars and time. And because that would become publicly known, it would make customers want to churn. My next question to him was, has that ever happened here before? His answer was no. They'd been in business 10 years. I said, that's okay. Has it happened to anyone, competitors you know? He goes, no. So I thought to myself, Carl Sagan, right? The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. The absence of evidence, not the evidence of absence. Yeah, I got that right. Okay. And I thought to myself, you know, what he's talking about is plausible. I don't know that yet. In that same day conversation, I found from the chief privacy officer and from the CTO that they were persisting 2 trillion records of PII. I just came back from globally managing GE Healthcare, and then before that, Kaiser Permanente, right? I was used to massive breach data. But the CEO was under this impression that that brand damage was a big thing. They were all under that. They hadn't bothered to pick up the cushions, look under the carpets, and realize what their real material risk was, which was data breach. That data was stored in S3 buckets. This is 10 years ago. That was back in a day where, if you remember, S3 buckets were all the rage, exposed buckets. That company has subsequently had 2 breaches of S3. They didn't even know it, didn't think about it. Great question. Sorry, I kind of went off on that.
Okay, I think just to add to what you said, right? I think there's the side of basically when was the last time any of you decided not to continue with a service provider because they sent you a notice that they had a breach? Like, when do we do that? Even, and we're in security. So I think that's changing from a brand reputation perspective, customer churn. People, it's just kind of whatever desensitization or whatever it is. And then if you look at, you know, whether the retail company that had this thing in UK or most companies, just from a brand perspective, you know, they tend to not see a longer term effect of customers just because there was a breach. Now, if there was an outage and people lost money and that kind of stuff, that is a different. But just because your name was, and because some of the records were in the dark web, you know, that part is not as big as it used to be from a people perspective. Of course, nobody wants their name in the thing, but I mean, if you look at CrowdStrike, how many people stopped using CrowdStrike because they caused such a big outage? I mean, very few people actually stopped using CrowdStrike. So I think that what we see is most of the time the biggest fear is that of a stopping of the business, right? If I cannot conduct transactions for a week is the biggest concern that most people will say in the management side, right? And of course, you don't, if there's data stolen, it's in the dark web, there's a playbook for that. You get Mandiant, they do this thing offline, but your business is continuing. And I think it's a good question because it's hard to quantify it that way, but if you look at the market cap or the stock of those companies that, you know, have had these kind of things, just if it's just a reputational thing, seems like they tend to recover quickly.
Yeah. With the Target breach, was obviously a while ago, people were claiming, oh, there was, and those of you who read the book know this, they were saying, oh my gosh, there was massive brand impact. You could see it in the stock market, but the actual fluctuation that they had was within normal fluctuation at that time period. There was no empirical evidence that the breach had actually impacted their stock price. Not to say that it's not important. More importantly, you need to ask yourself, what would I see occurring specifically, mathematically, unambiguously, that A, that happened, B, more importantly, what was causal to that, right? So we always have to get to what's causal, because then we can get operational and do better. I got like a minute and a half left. Another question?
What about mental impact? If a company is breached, what about the mental impact on
What about cognitive impact?
Yeah, but of course, this is all based on figures. And you can count on that. But what about mental impact for employees when they have breached?
What do you think my question would be to someone, if someone said to me, like HR said to me, what about like mental impact, emotional impact to our team? What do you think I would say? What would be my first question? Anyone know? It's already damaged. Yeah, we always want to go to the evidence-based question. Okay, what would I see occurring that would let me know that that was happening? Oh, they would leave, there'd be a reduction in production, they would do less work, more sick, okay. I'd say, okay, then what specifically was causal to that, though? Not just the breach. Oh, you start saying things maybe overworked because you're understaffed, whatnot. You always want to get down, right, to the tangible. Remember, tangible versus intangible? We always want to get to the tangible. With that, I've got 43 seconds. One more question? All right. Well, hey, have a wonderful ROCon, okay? Do your risk yoga, and I'll be here if you have any further questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.